Welcome to Boring Pastimes. Tonight, you'll be guided through quiet corners of Ottoman life, coffee houses, hammams, caravanserais, kitchens, madrasis, and gardens. These are not stories of battles or sultans, but of ordinary routines, small details, and forgotten rhythms. Let the slow unfolding of daily life carry you into rest. As the water in a fountain whispers and the sound of chess pieces tapping fades, may history keep you company as you drift into sleep. Story 1. The Chessboard of Constantinople. Leisure and logic in Ottoman coffeehouses. So imagine yourself stepping into a coffeehouse in Constantinople during the mid-17th century. The air is thick, not with noise, but with the slow layering of scents. Roasted beans ground into a bitter powder, water boiled carefully over embers, and faint traces of tobacco curling into the ceiling beams. The Ottoman coffeehouse was rarely a place of bustle or dramatic events. It was, in truth, a space defined by stillness, punctuated by the occasional scrape of a chair, the quiet click of chess pieces placed on a wooden board, or the low murmur of two men exchanging gossip about the price of grain. For you, the visitor, the first thing to notice would not be the games or the talk, but the arrangement of space itself. Low wooden benches are pressed against plaster walls, covered with thin cushions that sag with years of use. Tables are not spread evenly, but gathered in corners, their surfaces scarred by cups left too long in one place. Light filters unevenly, spilling from small windows or through the doorway that remains half open to let the smoke drift outward. The floor is beaten earth, cool underfoot, carrying with it the faint smell of dust and dampness. These are not places built for spectacle, but for long afternoons that pass almost unnoticed. The clientele is mixed, yet always within bounds. Here sits a shopkeeper who has stepped away from his stall for a brief respite. There is an apprentice, barely a teenager, nervously holding a cup too hot for his fingers, eager to seem older among men. And across the room is a retired janissary, his hands large and calloused, but softened now by the simple act of arranging chess pieces in their square formation. Coffee houses were one of the few public rooms in the Ottoman world where men of different stations mingled without ceremony. Wealth did not buy better chairs, nor did status offer the privilege of louder speech. In the coffee house, the rhythm of conversation and the rules of games leveled differences. Yet, while these details might seem ordinary, they formed the skeleton of social life in Ottoman towns. A merchant might spend hours here without speaking more than a handful of words. What mattered was presence, the silent recognition of being part of a collective pause, of stepping into a room where time seemed to stretch differently. The most enduring pastime in such coffee houses was the game of chess, imported centuries earlier through Persian and Arabic traditions. Chess in the Ottoman Empire had acquired a particular prestige. To play was not only to pass time, but to demonstrate patience, foresight, and calm calculation. Boards were often carved from walnut or inlaid with mother-of-pearl, though the more modest houses relied on simple wooden grids. Pieces varied, too. Some were elegantly shaped, while others were nothing more than worn lumps, their identities recognized only by habit. The beginning of a game rarely attracted notice. One man would lift a pawn forward, the faint thud muffled by the chatter nearby. His opponent would respond in kind, and the game would settle into a silence deeper than before. Each move stretched into minutes, sometimes half an hour, while cups of coffee cooled, untouched, at the players' sides. To watch such a game required patience of its own. For spectators, there was no cheering, no bursts of applause. Instead, eyes followed the slow dance of pieces, and comments, when they came, were whispered. But chess was never merely a game. In these coffeehouses, it doubled as a language. A bold move might be read as arrogance, a careful retreat as humility. Observers formed quiet judgments about the temperament of the players. Some men earned reputations not for their victories, but for the style in which they approached the board: rash, cautious, ponderous, or sly. Even when the game ended, the echoes of it lingered in conversation, folded into gossip alongside reports of harvests, trade routes, or the state of the Janissary Corps. And gossip itself was another current that defined the Ottoman Coffeehouse. Unlike the bustling markets outside, where news was shouted, bargained, and distorted by urgency, here information circulated slowly, shaped by memory and repetition. A rumor might begin as a question about the Sultan's new decree on tobacco imports. It would then pass, softened, from one table to another, altered only by the tone of voice or the arch of an eyebrow. By evening, it became less a piece of news and more a shared reflection, indistinguishable from speculation. The pace of coffeehouse talk was measured, unhurried, and this slow rhythm gave it a peculiar durability. What, then, was the true function of such a place? Was it leisure? Yes, but not solely. Was it commerce? In part, though coins exchanged here were only for small cups and tobacco rolls. Was it politics? Perhaps, though rarely in the open sense. The Ottoman authorities often worried that coffeehouses were breeding grounds for dissent. Yet, more often than not, they were breeding grounds for idleness, for the kind of idle reflection that shapes thought without ever giving it sharp edges. Even the act of drinking coffee was an exercise in patience. Unlike modern cups designed for quick consumption, Ottoman coffee was thick, almost syrupy, brewed directly with grounds that settled at the bottom. One did not gulp, but sipped slowly, letting the liquid cool between pauses in conversation. The sediment at the bottom was often left untouched, though some amused themselves by attempting to read patterns in a humble cousin too. Fortune telling this afternoon rhythm, the faint scrape of chess pieces, the low murmur of gossip, the measured sips of coffee was what gave the coffeehouse its peculiar identity. Time seemed to lose urgency. Hours could pass unnoticed, broken only by the arrival of fresh embers to keep the water boiling or the rearrangement of cushions as one guest replaced another. But perhaps the most curious detail was not what happened inside, but what did not. The coffeehouse was not a space for women, nor for children beyond a certain age. It was not a space of music, save for the occasional pluck of a saz in larger establishments. It was not even a space of clear debate, despite authorities' suspicions. It was, instead, a carefully crafted pause in the flow of life outside. And in that pause, countless small details: how a piece was moved, how a rumor was phrased, how a cup was held carried weight. To the untrained eye, it was boring, but to those who lived within it, it was structure, rhythm, and meaning. So, As you sit in this imagined room, watching a pawn advance across the board and listening to the low hum of voices that blur into one another, you might begin to wonder, was the coffee house merely a place to waste hours? Or was it, in its very stillness, one of the quiet engines that shaped Ottoman social life? The afternoon in a coffee house was rarely about conclusion. Unlike the swift market exchange, where a price was named, bargained, and agreed upon within minutes, here words stretched out like the smoke drifting above the lamps. A man could spend half an hour circling a single point in conversation, not because he lacked clarity, but because slowness itself was the custom. You would notice this if you lingered by a table of older men. Their talk rarely began with the matter at hand. Instead, they circled around it, beginning perhaps with an observation about the weather, then recalling a similar day from years before, then drawing a comparison to a harvest season, before finally arriving at a thought on the current price of barley. By the time the subject was reached, the urgency had long since dissolved, and what remained was a shared sense of continuity. In this way, the coffee house was less about information than about affirmation. To sit among others and hear words repeated, reshaped, and reconsidered was to be reminded of belonging. The empire stretched wide from the Balkans to the edges of Arabia. But in these rooms, the enormity of the state was reduced to the digestible fragments of talk. The arrival of a new governor in a distant province, the rumor of a war, the adjustment of taxes on salt, all of these vast events were handled in miniature here, turned into stories that could be held and passed around like the small porcelain cups in each man's hand. Still, not all conversations were equal. Some tables carried reputations. A group of scribes, for instance, might gather daily in one corner, their ink-stained fingers betraying their profession. They discussed poetry, the merits of copying styles, or the subtle shifts in courtly language. To sit near them was to overhear words too polished for the ears of a simple artisan. On the other side of the room, a circle of traders might whisper about caravans delayed by snow in Anatolia, or a shipment of wool that failed to arrive in the docks of Galata. Their words were plain, but their meaning heavy with financial consequence. The games of chess were woven into these conversations like a counterpoint, while two players leaned silently over the board. Their neighbors spoke in half-lowered voices, the two activities running parallel, yet never colliding. Sometimes a player, waiting for his opponent's move, would interject into nearby gossip, offering a single remark before returning to the game. It was not unusual for a chessboard to remain in play for hours, even if only a handful of moves had been made, while talk ebbed and flowed around it. And then there was the role of the storyteller. Coffee houses did not host grand theatrical performances, yet they were not without their performers. A Median oral storyteller might appear, often unannounced, standing near the doorway, or choosing a slightly elevated spot. He would begin, not with flourish, but with a quiet clearing of the throat. His tales were not shouted. They were delivered in a steady rhythm, alternating between prose and verse, always measured so as not to disturb the calm atmosphere. The stories were often moral in nature, drawn from epics, folk tales, or religious parables. Yet the true art lay not in the content but in the pacing, which matched the slow unfolding of everything else in the room. When a meta spoke, chessboards paused, and cups cooled. Even the gossip softened, not out of reverence, but because listening required stillness. The tale might describe a hero's journey across distant lands. Yet what held the audience was not the excitement of battles, but the tiny details. How long the road stretched, how many nights were spent in silence, how the hero measured time by the changing of the moon. These details mirrored the lives of the listeners themselves, who measured their own days by the grinding of beans, the boiling of water, the slow marking of accounts. In such ways, the coffeehouse became a mirror of the empire. It reflected its diversity, its inequalities, and its quiet negotiations. A Greek merchant might sit beside a Muslim artisan. A Jew might exchange nods with an Armenian scribe. They did not erase their differences, but they shared the same cup, the same smoke-filled air, the same rhythm of time stretched thin. And yet, beneath the stillness, the authorities often suspected a hidden current. Coffeehouses were periodically closed by decree, their owners fined, their patrons scattered. The stated reasons varied. Sometimes it was the moral hazard of idleness, sometimes the suspicion of un-Islamic practices, sometimes fear that talk here might stir unrest. But closures rarely lasted. The habit of gathering, of sipping, of gossiping and gaming proved stronger than edicts. Coffeehouses would reopen under new names, in new corners, or with a token change in decor. To imagine one of these closures is to picture sudden silence. Chairs left empty, the familiar hum of the room replaced by the creak of shutters nailed shut. Men who had spent decades with the same routine were forced into different rhythms, standing in the street, leaning against market stalls, or sitting in mosque courtyards to continue their conversations. Yet the difference was palpable. Without the framed pause of the coffeehouse, words lost some of their weight. Talk in the open air drifted too easily, scattered by wind and interrupted by traffic. The room itself had been part of the conversation, its stillness anchoring the slow pace of thought. When the coffeehouses reopened, the relief was quiet but deep. Men returned not just for the drink, but for the measured enclosure of time itself. The authorities may have seen danger in these rooms, but the patrons saw stability, a repetition that bound days together. By the 17th century, coffeehouse had become so entrenched in Ottoman urban life that their absence was almost unimaginable. Travelers from Europe noted their peculiarity, spaces where men sat for hours without any apparent purpose, consuming a drink that did not intoxicate, passing the day in games that never seemed to end. To those accustomed to taverns filled with ale and noise, the Ottoman coffeehouse seemed both dull and strangely disciplined. And here lies the question that hovers over this quiet space. Was the coffeehouse merely an escape from labor, or was it a hidden workshop of ideas, shaping thought as slowly and deliberately as a pawn advancing across the board? If you had returned to that same coffeehouse a decade later, little would have seemed changed. The cushions might have sagged more deeply, the boards worn smoother, and perhaps a new set of cups introduced, but the rhythm remained identical. Games unfolding move by move, gossip whispered into the folds of smoke, stories delivered with patient cadence. In this unchanging surface lay the enduring power of the Ottoman coffeehouse. What kept men coming back year after year was not novelty, but predictability. The bazaar might roar with shifting fashions, The court might alter laws and appointments. With bewildering speed, wars might flare at distant frontiers. But within the coffee house, the day could be trusted to unfold slowly, reliably, with the same faces, the same habits, and the same movements of pawns across the board. It was continuity, made tangible, and yet, from the perspective of history, such continuity carried influence of its own. Coffeehouses, precisely because they offered no official platform, became subtle spaces of connection. The merchant who paused over a chess game might exchange news with a scribe. The artisan who listened to a Meda's tale might absorb lessons that had traveled across provinces. The retired soldier might reflect on rumors of unrest, weighing them silently as he measured his next move. These rooms were not universities, nor courts, nor marketplaces, but they contained traces of all three. The chessboard, in particular, acted as both metaphor and practice. To move a piece was to demonstrate planning, to think beyond the immediate, two-way consequence. In a world where politics shifted with the moods of sultans and viziers, the game offered a model of order. Even those who never wrote a single word of strategy practiced the habits of anticipation and restraint. Through its squares, the pace of coffeehouse life also trained a kind of patience that seeped into urban rhythms, to wait for one's turn at the board, to sip slowly, to listen to a rumor passed 3 times before responding. These small acts cultivated endurance. In times of scarcity or sudden change, such endurance mattered. A famine could not be solved by talk in a coffeehouse, but the ability to absorb uncertainty without collapse was itself a form of survival. Travelers noticed this quality. European observers often wrote with a mixture of bemusement and admiration. They recorded how men could sit for half a day, neither restless nor drunk, content with the smallest of entertainments. For those accustomed to more raucous taverns, it was perplexing that a society could find satisfaction in slowness. But what appeared dull from outside was, for insiders, a carefully maintained form of order. The authorities, too, slowly adjusted their stance. While early decrees condemned coffeehouses as nests of idleness or dissent, over time the futility of suppression became clear. These rooms had become too essential to urban life. Eventually, regulation replaced prohibition. Taxes on coffee beans, inspections of establishments, occasional monitoring of suspicious gatherings. Yet the basic institution remained untouched. In a way, the empire itself had to accept. Slow hum of these rooms was part of its fabric. But the coffeehouse was more than just a local phenomenon. It was part of a global current. Coffee had traveled from Yemen to Cairo, then to Istanbul, and from there to Venice, London, and beyond. By the late 17th century, European cities had their own versions of coffeehouses, each developing distinct characters. London's became centers of commerce and pamphleteering. Paris's tied to philosophy and politics. Compared to these, the Ottoman version remained quieter, less formal, more saturated with everyday life. But the seed was the same, a drink that encouraged wakefulness, paired with a space designed for slowness. One could even say that the global spread of coffeehouses began in the stillness of these Ottoman rooms. Without their example, European merchants might not have imagined the possibility of gathering men around small cups for hours of talk. And without that spread, the intellectual life of the Enlightenment might have lacked marked one of its key meeting places. Yet, within the Ottoman context, the legacy was not intellectual revolution, but cultural endurance. Even as empires shifted, wars were lost or won as trade routes altered. The coffeehouse preserved a pattern of life. It allowed men to imagine themselves as part of something stable. The repetition of games, the recycling of gossip, the steady presence of familiar faces, all these provided reassurance in a world otherwise uncertain. If you listen closely in imagination, you can almost hear the overlapping layers of time in a single room. A pawn moved forward in 1620 echoes the same sound as a pawn moved in 1670. The story of a meta in one decade is retold in another, slightly altered but fundamentally the same. Even the gossip about prices and governors follows a cyclical pattern tied to harvests and politics that never fully resolve. In this way, the coffeehouse became not a place of history's grand turning points, but a place where history's rhythms were absorbed and endured. And, as centuries passed, the institution outlasted many of the men who worried over it. Coffeehouses remained when viziers fell from favor, when wars ended in treaties, when generations of artisans passed their trades to sons. Their dullness was their resilience. Nothing spectacular was required of them. Their power lay in providing endless repetition. In modern Istanbul, many of these old establishments have vanished or transformed, yet the essence lingers. To sit in a quiet kahvehan today, to hear the low murmur of conversation, to watch men lean over a backgammon board or shuffle dominoes, is to glimpse a direct line to those 17th century afternoons. The pace remains slow, the cups small, the conversations circular. The empire has long since dissolved, but the rhythm of its coffeehouses continues. So, as you leave our imagined room, dusty cushions, smoke-stained beams, chessboards waiting for the next move, you might ask yourself, was it the grandeur of palaces and battles that held the empire together? Or was it, in some quiet way, the endless afternoons of ordinary men playing games and passing words in the stillness of a coffeehouse? Story 2. Copper pots and simmering time, Ottoman kitchens, and the slow art of cooking. If the coffeehouse was a place of public leisure, the kitchen was its quiet domestic counterpart, a space defined not by conversation, but by necessity. To step into an Ottoman household in the 17th century was to enter a world where meals were not hurried events, but slow processes that stretched across hours, measured by the burn of wood and the gradual thickening of stews. At first glance, the kitchen was unremarkable. Floors were often bare earth or simple stone. The hearth, built low and deep, crouched against one wall, blackened by years of smoke. Above it hung iron hooks for kettles and spits, and nearby stood shelves crowded with copper pots of every size. These pots, beaten into shape by coppersmiths in the markets, were both durable and demanding. Copper cooked evenly, but tarnished quickly. It needed constant polishing with ash or sand to remain safe for use. The act of cooking, then, was inseparable from the act of maintenance. Water was drawn, not by twisting a tap, but by carrying it in clay or brass pitchers from wells or fountains. This task alone could shape the rhythm of meals. A servant or family member might make several trips before enough was gathered to wash grains, rinse vegetables, and fill the cauldron for boiling. Firewood was another daily concern. Oak, pine, and olive branches were prized, each burning differently. Wood had to be gathered, dried, stacked, and cut to size before the day's cooking could even begin. Thus, before a single onion was chopped, labor had already been expended. The foods themselves reflected both geography and season. Wheat was the staple grain, ground into flour for bread or boiled into bulgur. Rice, more expensive, arrived through trade routes from Egypt or further east, and was reserved for wealthier households or special occasions. Lentils, chickpeas, and beans formed the backbone of everyday meals, their slow simmering filling the kitchen with earthy scents. Meat was rarer than one might imagine. While lamb and mutton were favored, they were costly, and most households relied on smaller portions, stretched through stews and pilafs rather than great roasts. Spices gave depth to these modest ingredients. Cinnamon, clove, pepper, and saffron were treasured, but their use was sparing. More common were onions, garlic, parsley, dill, and mint flavors grown in gardens or purchased fresh from vendors. Vinegar and yogurt, too, were staples, lending acidity and preservation to dishes that might otherwise spoil in the heat. Cooking in the Ottoman world was less about abundance than about coaxing richness from what was available. To watch a cook at work was to watch patience embodied. Vegetables were chopped slowly with curved knives on wooden boards, meat trimmed carefully of sinew, herbs pounded into paste with mortar and pestle. Each stage of preparation stretched into time, the pace dictated not by haste but by habit. The stew, once assembled, was left to simmer for hours, the lid rattling gently as steam escaped. Bread dough was kneaded with rhythmic pressure, then covered and left to rise. Not according to a clock, but to the feel of the air and the eye of the baker. This slowness was not inefficiency. Without refrigeration, food had to be prepared in ways that lasted. Stews thickened and reheated well. Dried grains kept for months. Pickled vegetables ensured sustenance when fresh produce disappeared from markets. The kitchen was not only a place of cooking, but a place of preservation, where the future was secured one jar, one loaf, one pot at a time. It was also, in its own way, a place of hierarchy. In wealthier homes, servants performed the bulk of labor. A cook might command assistance, overseeing the timing of dishes with practiced authority. In poorer households, the family itself rotated duties, with women bearing the primary responsibility, but often aided by children or elderly relatives. Regardless of wealth, however, the rhythm was similar. Fire tended, water fetched, pots scrubbed, meals shared. Meals themselves were communal but restrained. Food was typically served on a low round tray, around which the family or household gathered. Portions were taken with bread or spoons, eaten directly from shared dishes. The emphasis was not on individual plates but on collective sustenance. Even the order of eating reflected custom. Elders and guests first, children and servants after. From the outside, it might seem monotonous: grain, legumes, stew, bread, repeat. But monotony was itself a kind of security. In an empire stretched across climates and provinces, famine or shortage could strike unpredictably. To rely on a small repertoire of reliable dishes was to build resilience into daily life. If you imagine yourself in such a kitchen, perhaps seated on a stool while the cook tends the hearth. You would notice the sensory world that surrounded the work, the sharp crack of kindling, the hiss of water meeting hot copper, the aroma of onions browning until golden, the rhythmic scrape of a wooden spoon against the bottom of a pot. These were not dramatic sounds, but they marked the steady progress of the day. And beyond the kitchen itself, the empire's infrastructure supported these rhythms. Grain taxes ensured the movement of wheat into cities. Caravans carried spices and rice across long routes. Fishermen supplied markets along the Bosphorus with anchovies and mackerel. The cook in her small kitchen was tied, invisibly, to vast networks of trade and taxation. Each pot of stew was not just a domestic act, but a miniature reflection of imperial order. In this way, the kitchen was both ordinary and immense. It was the beating heart of daily life, sustaining households across cities and villages, binding together empires of supply and demand. Yet, for those who lived within it, it was simply routine repeated actions, repeated flavors, repeated patience. But one question lingers as you leave the warmth of this kitchen. Did these long repetitive labors give women and servants a hidden strength in shaping Ottoman society? Or did the slowness of the kitchen bind them invisibly to cycles they could never escape? If the hearth provided the heat and the copper pot gave the form, then recipes provided the rhythm. Yet, an Ottoman recipe was not the neatly measured list of ingredients familiar to modern cookbooks. Instead, it was a mixture of memory, oral tradition, and instinct. A grandmother passed her knowledge to a daughter, who adjusted it according to what the market offered, who in turn passed it again, reshaped by household taste. Cooking was less about fixed formulas and more about understanding proportions, textures, and patience. One of the most enduring dishes was a broad category that included pilafs, stews, and porridges made from grains. A pilaf of rice might be enriched with clarified butter, onions, and bits of lamb, seasoned with cinnamon or cloves. A lentil stew, simpler and cheaper, required little more than onions, garlic, and a long simmer. Both could be eaten alone or accompanied by bread. The essential detail was time, grains swollen slowly in liquid, flavors merging at a pace that no fire could hurry without ruining. Bread itself was an anchor of life. Unlike the round loaves familiar in Europe, Ottoman bread often took the form of flat rounds, sometimes sprinkled with sesame seeds, sometimes left plain. Dough was kneaded in wide bowls, covered with cloth, and allowed to rise in the warm corners of kitchens. Baking was not always done at home. In many neighborhoods, communal ovens baked the dough of multiple families, each loaf marked with a distinctive pattern to identify its owner. The walk to and from the oven, balancing trays of unbaked dough and returning with steaming bread, was as much a part of daily routine as the meal itself. Pickling was another quiet but essential art. Cucumbers, turnips, cabbage, and carrots were preserved in brine, filling cellars with rows of jars sealed against time. Pickled vegetables brightened meals during winter months when fresh produce vanished from the markets. Yogurt served a similar role, both as a dish in its own right and as a base for sauces and soups. Its temps balanced the heaviness of grains. And meat and its preparation, fermenting milk in clay pots required nothing more than patience and consistency. In wealthier households, kitchens could be surprisingly complex. Large mansions and palaces employed entire staffs, with a head cook orchestrating dozens of assistants. The Topkapi Palace kitchens in Istanbul, for example, were vast halls filled with cauldrons large enough to feed hundreds. There, recipes became almost institutional, recorded in registers to ensure consistent supply to the Sultan and his court. But even in these grand kitchens, the principle remained the same: time, repetition, patience. The kitchen also structured social life within the household. Women bore the central responsibility, but their roles were not uniform. A young bride might begin her married life learning how to manage grain stores and portion firewood, while older women supervised servants or instructed daughters in family dishes. Children contributed small tasks, fetching water, grinding spices, or carrying trays. Men, for the most part, remained distant from the kitchen, though they reaped the daily results of its labor. Yet the division of roles was not absolute. In rural areas, where labor was scarce, men often joined in bread baking or meat preparation. In cities, cooks could be male, particularly in households with resources to employ them. Still, the image of the kitchen as a women's domain remained powerful, and it shaped the perception of daily labor as invisible routine and easily overlooked. Cooking also reinforced cycles of time larger than the day. Weekly rhythms centered on Friday, the congregational prayer day, when meals were often more elaborate. Seasonal rhythms shaped diets. Spring brought fresh herbs and greens. Summer delivered melons, figs, and cucumbers. Autumn meant grapes and walnuts. Winter leaned heavily on grains, pulses, and pickles. Religious calendars, too, shaped kitchens. During Ramadan, meals shifted to pre-dawn and after sunset, requiring careful timing of cooking to match the fast. During feast days, sweets like baklava, helva, or lakma appeared, filling kitchens with the smell of sugar and clarified butter. To understand the importance of sweets is to see another side of Ottoman cooking. While daily meals emphasized simplicity and sustenance, desserts were occasions for display. Syrupy pastries, often layered with nuts and drenched in honey, required skill and precision. These dishes were not everyday fare, but they lingered in memory, tied to festivals, weddings, and moments of generosity. They also connected kitchens to broader networks of trade. For sugar was an imported luxury, its presence in a dish signaling wealth and celebration. Despite these variations, monotony defined much of kitchen life. The repetition of chopping onions, stirring pots, kneading dough, scrubbing copperit wore grooves into the body as much as into memory. The sameness might feel dull, but it also created reliability. Families depended on this predictability, the assurance that no matter how uncertain the empire's politics or trade, dinner would come in familiar form. Yet kitchens could also be sites of quiet resistance and resilience. A woman managing her household might stretch a sack of grain further than her husband realized, setting aside small portions for leaner times. A servant might slip leftovers into her apron to feed her own family. Knowledge of preservation and substitution meant survival during shortages. These unremarkable decisions, repeated daily across thousands of homes, shaped the endurance of entire communities. If you step back and look at the empire as a whole, the kitchen appears both trivial and monumental. It consumed the labor of millions, yet rarely appeared in chronicles. Court historians wrote of wars, treaties, and dynasties, not of lentils and pickles. And yet, without the kitchens, the empire could not have endured. Soldiers on campaign depended on shipments of grain and bread. City populations relied on stable supplies. Rural families survived through careful preservation. And so, as the copper pot bubbles quietly on its hearth, one must ask, did the true strength of the Ottoman world lie not in its armies and palaces, but in the unnoticed, repetitive labors of those kitchens that never ceased to simmer? When you imagine an empire, the first images that arise are often soldiers in ranks, sultans in turbans, or ships gliding across seas. Rarely do you picture a copper pot of lentils, a tray of bread marked for the neighborhood oven, or the steady hum of a woman stirring a pot while children scamper around her feet. Yet, in many ways, the quiet continuity of the kitchen did as much to sustain the Ottoman world as any military campaign or palace intrigue. The hearth, small as it was, tied households to the empire's grand systems of supply. Grain moved from Anatolian fields to urban bakeries, peas from Balkan farms to stewpots in Istanbul, spices from distant India into palace kitchens. Each pot of rice pilaf was not just food, it was the final expression of networks of agriculture, taxation, trade, and transport. When ships failed to bring grain across the Black Sea, or when caravans were delayed by war, kitchens felt the shock first. An empire could stumble if bread became scarce. Take, for instance, the role of bread riots in Ottoman cities. Chroniclers record moments when bakers could not supply loaves at affordable prices. Crowds of hungry people, frustrated not with abstract politics, but with the failure of their daily sustenance, sometimes gathered in protest. For the ruling authorities, keeping kitchens fed was as essential as keeping borders secure. Thus, the state established grain reserves, regulated bread prices, and even punished bakers who cheated on weight. These policies reveal a profound truth. To govern the Ottoman Empire was, in part, to govern its kitchens. Yet kitchens were not only receivers of imperial supply, they were also transmitters of cultural meaning. The dishes prepared within them carried identities across generations. A family's recipe for lamb stew or helva tied them to ancestors. Regional dishes distinguished communities. The way yogurt was strained or bread was shaped marked subtle cultural boundaries. Even as the empire spanned continents, the kitchen anchored people to their immediate sense of belonging. The quiet repetition of kitchen labor also embedded values of patience, endurance, and care. These were not dramatic virtues, but durable ones. To rise before dawn and prepare dough to simmer lentils for hours, to clean copper until it gleamed all. These tasks required a kind of discipline that did not call attention to itself. This daily patience formed the rhythm of countless lives. It may not have changed the course of battles, but it preserved households, nurtured children, and made survival possible. The invisibility of this labor is striking. Historians of the time rarely mentioned the kitchen, except when describing the lavish feasts of the elite. The lives of ordinary cooks, mostly women, passed without record. Yet these cooks created continuity across centuries. ensuring that traditions survived even as empires rose and fell. Recipes, passed down orally, became living archives. They preserved memory more effectively than official documents, for they shaped the tastes and habits of entire populations. Consider the example of yogurt. Once a simple household fermentation, it became so central to Ottoman diets that it spread outward, influencing neighboring regions. Today, yogurt is a global staple, yet its Ottoman kitchens were among the key transmitters of the practice. The same is true of coffee, though not cooked in the kitchen in the same way as meals. Its preparations, lowly brewed, poured into small cups, accompanied by sweetsby, came a ritual of hospitality that continues to echo across modern Turkey, the Balkans, and the Middle East. Even the utensils themselves carried meaning. A copper pot could last for generations, repaired and retinned when necessary. A wooden spoon bore the marks of decades of stirring. Clay jars absorbed the tang of pickles or yogurt, their surfaces darkened with age. These objects embodied continuity, tying past to present, not through grand monuments, but through humble use. In their endurance, they remind us that history is not only written in stone, but also simmered in broth. The kitchen also illuminates the unequal structures of Ottoman life. Women bore the burden of sustaining households, often without recognition. Their labor was expected, invisible, and rarely acknowledged beyond the family. Yet this imbalance also reveals resilience. Women ensured the survival of households even when wars took away men, or when famine required ingenious substitutions. Their skill in stretching provisions, in preserving food, in maintaining routines under strains, quiet resilience ensured the empire's endurance far more than proclamations. From palaces. In this way, the Ottoman kitchen becomes a paradox. On one hand, it was repetitive, dull, and easily overlooked. On the other, it was essential, adaptive, and deeply meaningful. It reveals a different perspective on what sustains a society. The loud moments of battle or ceremony, but the unnoticed rhythms of daily survival. As the empire aged and eventually weakened, kitchens continued their steady labor. Even as borders shifted, families still needed dough, boiled lentils, and strained yogurt. In fact, long after the empire itself dissolved, its kitchens lived on in the habits of the people who inherited its traditions. Modern Turkish cuisine, Balkan stews, Levantine sweet salt, carry traces of those old Ottoman pots. So when you imagine history, try to picture not only the Sultan's throne, but also the copper pot simmering quietly on a village hearth. Consider how the survival of millions depended on the unseen patience of those kitchens, repeating tasks day after day, century after century. And wonder, if future historians study our own time, will they overlook our kitchens, too, forgetting that daily meals sustain societies just as much as politics or wars. Story 3. Steam, Stone, and Silence. An afternoon in the Ottoman bathhouse. The bathhouse, or hammam, was never meant to be dramatic. Unlike the palace, where architecture proclaimed grandeur, the hammam was designed for rhythm and repetition. Its purpose was not spectacle, but service, to provide warmth, cleanliness, and continuity to the daily and weekly cycles of Ottoman life. And yet, despite this modest aim, the bathhouse became one of the most enduring institutions of the empire. shaping both private hygiene and public life. Approaching a hammam from the street, you would notice a structure at once plain and solid. Unlike mosques with their soaring domes and minarets, the hammam's domes were lower, its windows smaller, its facade unassuming, built of stone, often attached to mosques or caravanserais. It blended into the urban fabric. The only clues to its presence were the small chimneys that vented steam into the air, and the steady trickle of people coming and going with bundles of towels under their arms. Inside, the first space was the soyun malik, or changing room. Here, bathers undressed, placing their clothes in wooden cubicles, or leaving them with attendants. The room was often a square hall with a high ceiling, sometimes adorned with modest decoration-painted walls, carved wooden balconies. But its purpose was practical, to transition from the outside world to the inner chambers of heat. From here, you would enter the warm room, the alikalak, where the air was heavy with moisture and warmth. The stone floor radiated heat beneath your feet, and the hum of dripping water echoed softly. This was a space for adjusting, letting the body accustom itself to the change in temperature before stepping deeper. Then, at the center of the building, lay the haritha hot room. The hot room was the true heart of the hammam. Its dome rose overhead, pierced with small glass-covered openings that let in pinpricks of light, creating a constellation of soft glows in the mist. The walls and floor were lined with marble or stone, warm to the touch. In the middle stood the gugik tasi, a broad, heated platform of stone. Here bathers reclined, sweating as their bodies loosened, preparing for cleansing. Around the edges were basins of water, each with taps for hot and cold. Wooden buckets and copper bowls were used to pour water over the body in slow, steady rhythms. The act of bathing itself was ritualized, though not rigid. Some bathers came alone, quietly washing themselves with soap and water, rubbing their skin with rough cloths. Others paid attendants, known as telaks, for scrubbing and massage. The telak's work was thorough, rubbing off layers of dead skin with a coarse mitt, kneading muscles, and rinsing with alternating splashes of hot and cold water. The process could be vigorous, but it was always methodical, carried out in the same order day after day. For women, the hammam carried additional layers of meaning. It was one of the few socially sanctioned spaces outside the home where women could gather freely. In the hot mist of the bathhouse, veils and social restraints dissolved. Here, women chatted, exchanged news, arranged marriages, and strengthened bonds of kinship. The hammam was both cleansing and communal, a place where the slow rhythms of conversation and ritual shaped lives as surely as the heat shaped skin. Children, too, experienced the hammam as part of growing up. Mothers brought infants to be washed, teaching them from an early age the routines of cleansing. Special occasions, such as weddings, circumcisions, or holidays often included group visits to the hammam. Thus, the bathhouse marked milestones as well as ordinary weeks. The design of the hammam reflected a balance between privacy and community, while the central hot room encouraged shared presence. Niches and side chambers allowed smaller groups or individuals to retreat. Time in the hammam was not hurried. One could linger for hours, moving between hot, warm, and cool rooms, alternating between bathing, resting, and drinking water or tea. The pace was slow, matching the cycles of sweating and cooling. The hammam also carried a spiritual undertone. In Islamic tradition, cleanliness was closely tied to ritual purity, required for prayer and religious observance. The hammam thus provided not only physical hygiene, but also the means to maintain spiritual readiness. For many, entering the hammam was less about indulgence and more about duty carried out week after week in the same quiet rhythm. Yet, for all its familiarity, each hammam visit carried a subtle drama of contrasts: the sting of cold water after long heat, the echo of whispered conversations under domes, the mingling of solitude and community. These contrasts never broke the calm, but they made the experience memorable enough that bathhouses remained central to Ottoman life for centuries. Still, one might wonder, why did this institution, seemingly so mundane, endure across centuries and continents? What made the simple acts of steam, stone, and water so essential to the Ottoman world that even sultans built grand hammams beside their palaces, and villagers constructed smaller versions in remote towns? If the hot stone platform was the physical center of the hammam, conversation was its social heart. Beneath the mist and echo of dripping water, words carried differently, voices softened, and privacy seemed at once diminished and expanded. Diminished, because walls and domes echoed every syllable; expanded because steam blurred faces and gestures, creating a sense of intimacy even among strangers. For women, this was especially important. In a society where daily life often kept them within the household, the hammam offered a rare opportunity for gathering. A visit to the bathhouse was not a hurried necessity, but an outing, sometimes lasting most of the day. Women arrived in groups, bringing food, sweets, and embroidered cloths to spread on benches. Between rounds of bathing, they shared gossip about neighbors, discussed marriages, or exchanged advice on children and household management. The hammam became a female commons, a space to strengthen networks that reached beyond individual homes. Men, too, found their social spaces in hammams, though their routines often differed. Merchants and artisans might schedule visits in the afternoon after the bustle of the marketplace. Here, among steam and soap, deals were struck and disputes softened. In the relaxed environment where clothing and titles were set aside, men could meet as near equals. The hammam was not a council hall or a court, but it was a place where conversation flowed freely. And in those conversations, small economic and political agreements were often shaped. The role of the hammam as an economic institution extended far beyond its walls. Operating a bathhouse required constant resources: wood or charcoal to heat the furnaces, attendants to maintain fires, water supplies that had to be carefully managed, the wages of telaks, the fees paid by bathers, the upkeep of the building all. This formed part of the urban economy. Many hammams were built as charitable endowments, vakif, meaning their revenues supported schools, mosques, or soup kitchens. A single bathhouse could thus fund both hygiene and education, linking cleanliness to broader networks of welfare. Inside, money and service changed hands quietly. Bathers paid small fees to enter, with additional charges for massage or scrubbing. Wealthier visitors tipped generously, sometimes securing better service or private niches. For attendants, the work was demanding: hauling buckets, stoking fires, scrubbing bodies, but it provided steady employment. In some families, the profession of telek passed from father to son, embedding the labor of the hammam within family. Traditions.hammams also intersected with milestones of life. Weddings were preceded by galen hammamitha brides, bathware, female relatives and friends accompanied the bride-to-be, celebrating with singing and henna while steam enveloped the space. Circumcision ceremonies for boys sometimes included group visits to the bathhouse. Religious holidays brought larger crowds as families cleansed themselves before festivals. Thus, the hammam stood at the crossroads of private and public, individual and communal, mundane and ceremonial. In quieter moments, the hammam was also a place of listening. News spread through whispers, retold between basins. A war in the east, a new tax in the city, the scandal of a wealthy merchant's household. The bathhouse walls, misty and echoing, became an informal press office of the empire, where information and rumor mixed freely. For many, this gossip was as important as the cleansing itself, for it connected them to the wider rhythms of empire. Architecturally, the hammam reinforced these functions. The design encouraged gathering in shared spaces, yet it also provided niches for private groups. Heat slowed the body and the mind, creating a setting where people lingered rather than rushed. The rhythm of bathing, warming, sweating, scrubbing, cooling naturally gave rise to pauses, and in those pauses, conversation thrived. Unlike the marketplace, with its constant movement and bargaining, the hammam allowed words to stretch unhurriedly, as if time itself softened in the steam. Even conflict could be eased within the hammam. Accounts survive of merchants resolving disputes after bathing together, their softened bodies and relaxed minds more willing to compromise. The shared exposure, nakedness beneath towels, vulnerability in the heat, created a peculiar equality that formal settings often lacked. While it would be too much to say that hammams served as political chambers, they certainly influenced the smaller negotiations that shaped Ottoman urban life. But the hammam's role was not only in words or money. It shaped identities and reinforced social norms. To be absent from the hammam too long was to risk being marked as unclean or negligent. Regular attendance demonstrated respectability. In this way, the hammam functioned as a quiet mechanism of social regulation, ensuring that the rhythms of cleansing aligned with the rhythms of community. Yet for all its centrality, the hammam remained invisible in many chronicles of the empire. Like kitchens, it was a place of daily necessity, not dramatic event. And yet the steady hum of its fires, the routine of its attendants, and the murmur of its bathers formed a foundation for urban life. Without hammams, the empire's cities might have been less healthy, less connected, less humane. Still, one question lingers in the mist. Did the hammam's true power lie in its ability to cleanse bodies, or in its ability to quietly weave people together through conversation, ritual, and the subtle economy of steam? By the 17th century, hammams dotted the empire's cities, towns, and even villages. Istanbul alone boasted hundreds, their domes rising modestly above neighborhoods, their chimneys releasing faint threads of smoke and steam to walk through. The city was to pass the rhythm of bathhouses as naturally as mosques or markets. Yet, like so many institutions, their prominence would not remain untouched by the passing of centuries. The decline of the hammam was not sudden but gradual, shaped by shifts in technology, society, and taste. As private homes gained running water, the necessity of a public bath diminished. The ritual of weekly visits gave way to quicker, more private routines. By the 19th century, European notions of hygiene and modernization introduced plumbing systems, altering expectations of cleanliness. The hammam, once central, became increasingly symbolic, associated more with tradition than necessity. Yet this decline was not uniform. In rural towns, where infrastructure lagged, hammams continued to function as before. Villagers still gathered with towels and wooden clogs, still sat on heated stones while gossip circled in the mist. Even in cities, certain hammams retained life, especially those tied to traditions of marriage or festivals. Their decline in utility only strengthened their role as cultural heritage. Economically, the change was profound. Hammam attendants, once assured of steady work, faced shrinking livelihoods. Some bathhouses closed altogether, their stones reused for other purposes. Others survived by adapting, marketing themselves as sites of heritage, wellness, or even tourist curiosity. What had once been ordinary became exotic. For European travelers in the 19th century, a visit to an Ottoman hammam was a glimpse into a world of sensuality and ritual. Their writings, sometimes romanticized, sometimes mocking, reframed the hammam in Western imagination as a symbol of the Orient. Still, beyond foreign gazes, hammams remained tied to local rhythms. Women continued to gather there, keeping alive traditions of communal bathing, conversation, and celebration. Men, too, returned, not just for cleansing, but for the lingering comfort of ritual. The hammam survived because it was never only about hygiene. It was about connection to community, to tradition, and to the slow passage of time measured not by clocks but by sweat and water. Architecturally, many hammams endured even as their purpose shifted. Their domes, small star-shaped windows, and heated stones required specialized maintenance. Some fell into disrepair, their fires extinguished, their chambers cold. Others were restored, often with state or municipal support, recognized as heritage worth preserving. Walking into a hammam today in Istanbul or Sarajevo, one steps not only into a place of bathing, but into a continuity of centuries. The persistence of hammams raises an interesting reflection. What does it mean for an institution to survive beyond its necessity? Few now require a hammam for basic cleanliness, yet people still go. The answer may lie in the longing for slowness. Modern life, with its taps, showers, and hurried routines, provides efficiency but not ritual. The hammam, with its sequence of rooms, its pauses of heat and cool, its conversations in mist, offers something efficiency cannot: the chance to dwell in time. In this sense, hammams endure as counterweights to modernity. They remind us that cleansing can be unhurried, communal, and even boring in the best way. They preserve the Ottoman rhythm of life, not through grand monuments, but through small continuities: the pouring of water from a copper bowl, the faint echo of voices under a dome, the long pause on a heated stone. The hammam also embodies the persistence of women's spaces across history. Even as public roles for women shifted, the hammam remained a sanctuary of community. Here, generations met, grandmothers instructing young brides, mothers soothing infants, friends laughing softly in steam. The rituals may appear simple, but their continuity reveals a powerful thread of resilience, woven through centuries of change. As for modern echoes, one finds them everywhere. The Turkish bath is now a global term, offered in spas far from the Ottoman world. Yet these recreations often strip away the slowness and ordinariness that made hammams meaningful. They highlight luxury, not repetition. Still, even these diluted forms testify to the lasting allure of steam and stone. So, what remains of the hammam's history? Stones that have felt centuries of footsteps, domes that have heard whispers in countless languages, attendants whose families carried on traditions long after their necessity faded, and the quiet realization that something as mundane as bathing could shape the endurance of an empire, perhaps. Then the hammam teaches us this: history is not only the record of battles, decrees, or rulers. It is also the slow breath of steam rising day after day, the rhythm of water poured from copper bowls, the conversations that drift away unrecorded but not forgotten. And as you imagine that soft mist, it is worth asking, in our own time, what quiet rituals will outlast us, remembered not for their necessity, but for the way they brought people together. Story 4. Stones, stables, and silent courtyards. Life inside an Ottoman caravanserai. Imagine yourself on a long Ottoman road. Path is uneven, packed dirt or cobblestones, depending on the region, and the sun has begun to sink behind distant hills. You are weary, not from hours, but from days of travel. The pack animals, donkeys, camels, or mules, plod slowly, their hooves clattering against the stones. Dust rises with each step, clinging to clothes and faces. Ahead, at last, you see the square silhouette of a caravanserai. The caravanserai was not built to dazzle. Its purpose was endurance. From the outside, its thick stone walls appeared more like a fortress than an inn. The structure was plain, often with few windows, its strength in its sheer bulk. A single gate, heavy and iron-studded, opened into a courtyard. At dusk, when caravans arrived, the gatekeeper swung it shut behind them, securing travelers and animals alike within the protective walls. Inside, the courtyard opened wide, a space for animals to rest. Troughs lined the walls for water, and stable boys moved among them, loosening saddles, carrying bundles, feeding hay. Above, on the second level, small rooms lined the walls, each plain but sufficient. A raised platform for bedding, a niche for belongings, and sometimes a small window looking down onto the courtyard. The design was practical, shaped by centuries of repetition. Travelers needed three things: safety, water, and rest. Wells or cisterns ensured fresh water for both humans and animals. Thick walls deterred bandits. The rhythm of the place was calm but purposeful. Animals watered and fed first, then goods stored. A stew of lentils or chickpeas, flatbread baked in clay ovens, perhaps olives or cheese if available. Travelers carried their own provisions too, and fires in the courtyard or kitchens filled the air with mingling smells. The soundscape of the caravanserai was a tapestry of languages: Turkish, Persian, Arabic, Greek, Armenian, Albanian, Slavic dialects. Each caravan brought its own tongue, and together they echoed beneath the vaulted ceilings. Yet, despite this diversity, the mood was subdued. Travel was exhausting, and most preferred rest to revelry. After meals, men sat quietly, sipping coffee or tea if it was available, discussing routes and prices in low voices. Others unrolled mats in their rooms, the dust of the road still clinging to their clothes, and drifted quickly into sleep. The courtyard dimmed as lamps flickered along its arcades. The caravanserai was not merely a stopping place. In a vast network of trade, spaced roughly a day's journey apart, these inns formed a chain across the empire, allowing merchants to move goods with relative safety. Without them, commerce would have faltered. The empire's wealth depended not only on armies and taxes, but also on these plains, sturdy courtyards, where weary animals drank and weary men rested. Even for those not engaged in long-distance trade, the caravanserai shaped daily rhythms. Local farmers brought surplus goods to sell to passing caravans. Craftsmen repaired saddles or wagons within its walls. Innkeepers and stable boys lived their lives in cycles of arrival and departure, their weeks measured by the flow of travelers. For them, the caravanserai was not a novelty, but a home. Every evening, animals watered. Every evening, packs unloaded. For each caravan carried news and goods from distant lands. The caravanserai was a paradox, monotonous in its tasks, yet dynamic in its role as a meeting point of worlds. But if you stand in the courtyard, listening to the creak of leather harnesses and the soft thud of hooves settling on straw, one thought lingers. How many empires depended not on grand palaces or mighty armies, but on these unremarkable stones, these unrecorded nights of quiet rest? The gates of the caravanserai close at dusk, the heavy iron latches echoing through the courtyard. For travelers, this sound is a comfort. It means safety. For those who live and work within the walls, it is the signal that another cycle of routine begins. The caravanserai was more than a traveler's was a small community, sustained by predictable tasks, invisible hands, and the quiet exchange of labor for survival. Often the most recognizable figure of the caravanserai. His role was simple yet essential. He recorded arrivals, kept track of which caravans entered, and watched over the keys. The gate was both physical and symbolic. Without it, the courtyard would be exposed to thieves and raiders. A good gatekeeper was trusted by all, for he carried responsibility not just for doors, but for the lives inside. By day he sat near the entrance, under a wooden canopy, keeping an account book. The book itself was modest rows of names, places of origin, and sometimes a note about the goods carried. It was not a census for history, but for order, ensuring that disputes over space or theft could be settled later. The stable boys, once the gate closed, the most urgent tasks belonged to the stable boys. They were usually young, often locals, who grew up in nearby villages, earning a living by tending the animals of strangers. Their labor was ceaseless, leading mules to troughs, spreading hay, brushing coats, tightening ropes. The boys moved constantly, carrying buckets of water or bundles of fodder, their hands rough from rope burns, their clothes smelling of sweat and animals. It was dull, repetitive work. Yet without it, the caravan could not continue its journey. The boys rarely traveled beyond their home province. Yet through their hands passed beasts that had crossed deserts, mountains, and seas. Their lives were rooted, but their labor connected them to the world's movement. The cook and the kitchen in the far corner of the courtyard Smoke rose from the communal kitchen. The cook's work began early, preparing pots of lentil soup, bread dough, or rice. He cooked not for taste but for sustenance, measuring portions by necessity. Large iron cauldrons hung over the fire, the same dishes simmering day after day. The smell of onions, garlic, and oil lingered in the air, absorbed into the stone walls. Meals were often eaten in silence, travelers seated in small groups or alone. Bread dipped into broth, beans mashed against flatbread, dried fruit chewed slowly as dessert. Some carried their own spices or dried meat to add flavor, but the base meal remained simple. Hunger, not delicacy, was the priority. Merchants at work the arcades along the courtyard doubled as storerooms and shops. By day, merchants opened their bundles, displaying wares for other travelers. Silk from Persia, wool from Anatolia, copper, pots from the Balkans, spices from Arabia. All of these appeared under the same vaulted arches. Most transactions were modest, a length of cloth exchanged for silver, a few jars of oil sold to another merchant. Larger deals happened quietly, whispered between two men sitting cross-legged on carpets in the shade. A handshake sealed the agreement, often more binding than any written contract. Yet these markets were not bustling bazaars. The caravanserai was no place for crowds. Transactions were steady but subdued, each merchant aware that tomorrow he must pack everything again and move on. The arcades were filled not with shouting, but with murmurs, the shuffle of fabric, the clink of scales. Languages of the courtyard diff, you paused to listen. The caravanserai was a school of languages. Turkish was often the common tongue, but Persian poets, Greek traders, Armenian craftsmen, and Arab camel drivers all spoke in their own accents. Pidgin phrases emerged, half Arabic, half Turkish, sometimes sprinkled with Italian from Venetian. Merchants. Communication was imperfect, but necessity bred creativity. Prices could be haggled with gestures, water requested with a nod, directions given with hands tracing shapes in the air. This diversity brought curiosity to a Balkan shepherd might taste dates for the first time, while a Persian merchant might try goat cheese from Macedonia. Stories of distant lands passed in fragments, rumors of wars, harvest failures, or new taxes. These were not the official histories of sultans, but the quiet news that shaped the rhythm of daily life. The lodgers in the upstairs chambers, the travelers themselves prepared for the night. Their rooms were spare, a raised platform for sleeping, sometimes covered with a rug or straw mat, a wall niche for belongings, perhaps a small oil lamp. Wealthier merchants carried bedding with them, while poorer travelers used rolled cloaks as pillows. Sleep was often shallow, disturbed by snores, coughs, or the braying of animals below. Yet the security of the walls outweighed the discomfort. Mattresses. The caravanserai keeper overseeing it all was the caravanserai keeper, the inn's manager. His duty was to ensure that no quarrel escalated, that payments were made, and that routine was upheld. He was rarely a man of wealth, but one of patience, able to listen to disputes over fodder, stolen trinkets, or overcharged rooms. He was judge and caretaker, balancing the interests of travelers and workers alike. His life was as repetitive as the walls around him, yet indispensable. Without his quiet authority, chaos could fracture the order of the caravanserai. the rhythm of days taken together. These figures, the gatekeeper, the stable boys, the cook, the merchants, the keeper, wove the invisible net of daily life. Nothing spectacular marked their days, but without them, the road itself would fail. Every dawn, the same routine. The gate opened, animals let out, bundles repacked, merchants departing in groups. Every dusk, new travelers arrived, and the cycle began again. The caravanserai was not a place of drama, but of survival. Its importance measured not in stories told, but in goods safely carried. Yet beneath this repetition lies a subtle question. What was it like to spend one's life within these walls, watching the empire pass by but never traveling beyond it? For the stable boy or the cook, the world arrived in fragments but never opened fully. Did they feel content in their rootedness, or restless watching others move on? At first glance, the caravanserai seemed a plain and modest place. Its walls lacked the grandeur of mosques, its courtyards were not as lively as city bazaars, and its meals could hardly rival the feasts of palaces. Yet, in its plainness lay its strength. It was in the unremarkable details of these inns that the Ottoman Empire stitched together its vast and varied lands. The network of roads, the Ottoman domains, stretched across continents, linking the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, the Balkans to the Middle East, and Anatolia to the deserts beyond. Such distances could easily fragment into isolation. Roads were fragile lifelines, threatened by bandits, weather, and the simple exhaustion of travel. Caravanserais were the stitches that held these lines together. Each one placed a day's journey apart. The traveler who left Idorn in the morning knew there would be a roof by nightfall. The merchant carrying silks from Aleppo knew there were safe wells along the Anatolian plateau. The soldier marching eastward found rest in the same stone chambers as the pilgrim bound for Mecca. Each caravanserai was a modest link, but together they formed a chain strong enough to sustain empire security. In stone, one of the caravanserai's quietest roles was military. While not fortresses, their thick walls and watchful gatekeepers offered security in unsettled times. During periods of unrest, the inns served as safe staging points for soldiers or tax officials. In border regions, they doubled as observation posts, for beauty than for control. For ordinary travelers, this meant peace of mind. A closed gate at night transformed uncertainty into safety. Behind those walls, a merchant could sleep, a mule could recover, and a pack of spices or wool could remain untouched. Safety itself became a commodity, and the caravanserai provided it quietly, without banners or proclamations. Commerce and continuity is easy to imagine the Ottoman economy as a series of bustling bazaars, grand markets in Istanbul, Cairo, or Damascus. But such markets would have starved without the invisible arteries that supplied them. Batch of dried apricots purchased by a traveling merchant, a repaired bridle handed back to a muleteer. These tiny acts kept goods flowing. It was commerce without spectacle, measured not in grand profits, but in steady survival. The dull rhythm of the caravanserai mirrored the rhythm of empire itself. Just as the Sultan's decrees required scribes, clerks, and tax collectors to transform words into order, seemed repetitive, it was also one of the most diverse places in the empire. Few other spaces gathered so many languages, faces, and customs within the same walls. A pilgrim from Bosnia might share bread with a spice merchant from Aleppo. An Armenian trader might teach a Turkish shepherd a phrase in Persian. This mingling rarely produced dramatic tales, but it quietly shaped perceptions. Through small encounters, distant peoples came to see themselves as part of a larger whole. Of the forgotten yet, while the merchants and pilgrims moved on, those who worked the caravanserai remained. The stable boy who brushed the dust off a camel might never see beyond his province. Them, the caravanserai, was both cage and anchor. They lived among stories of distant lands without ever departing. Their names rarely entered ledgers, their labor seldom mentioned in chronicles. Yet, without them, the system collapsed. The empire's vast mobility depended on their immobility. Stones and memory today. Many caravanserais stand abandoned, their courtyards silent, their troughs dry. Travelers hurry along highways without stopping, their journeys measured in hours instead of days. The rhythm of the old roads has faded, but if you stand in one of these ruins, you can still sense the old order. The echo of hooves against stone, the creak of leather packs, the low murmur of voices in many tongues, it lingers in imagination. What feels like silence now was once the hum of continuity, the quiet machinery of empire. Reflection, the caravanserai reminds us that history is not only made in palaces or battlefields, it is also built in stables, kitchens, and courtyards, where little seems to happen. The Ottoman Empire endured not only because of sultans and viziers, but because of places like these, where the ordinary labor of many held together the extraordinary scale of rule, and so, of continuity, unnoticed yet essential, like the caravanserais once did. Story 5. Ink, lamps, and long recitations. The slow days of an Ottoman madrasa mojin, the shift from the road into silence. You step through a low stone archway, leaving behind the noise of markets and caravans, and find yourself inside the square courtyard of a madrasa. Around you, rows of small chambers open beneath arched porticos. At the center stands a fountain, its water trickling steadily, its sound the only movement in a place designed for stillness. The madrasa, or religious college, was the heart of Ottoman education for centuries. Its purpose was not spectacle, nor even variety. Its task was repetition. Each new generation of students, the same texts, the same recitations, the same recitations. Knowledge here was not invented, but preserved, passed like a candle flame from one student to the next. Architecture of routine, the design of the madrasa shaped its rhythm. Students lived in small chambers along the courtyard, each one furnished with little more than a low mattress, shelves for books, and an oil lamp. In winter, the walls trapped the cold, and smoke from braziers curled into the air. In summer, the stone kept the rooms dim and cool. The courtyard was not just a space, but a discipline. Its fountain reminded students to purify themselves before prayer. Its open design ensured that sound carried. When the teacher spoke beneath the central portico, all could hear. The madrasa's architecture was not grand, but purposeful, training bodies as much as minds to live within measured order. The daily cycle the day began with the dawn called to prayer. Students rose from thin mattresses, washed at the fountain, and moved together to the mosque attached to the madrasa. The prayer was followed by a simple meal, flatbread olives, and perhaps a little cheese. Afterward, lessons began. Lessons? were slow, built on the rhythm of recitation. The teacher, or madaris, sat on a low cushion with students gathered in a semicircle. A text was read aloud, often from the Quran or from commentaries on law, grammar, or philosophy. Students repeated after him, their voices blending into a low hum. Pages turned slowly, ink stains marked fingers, and the words etched themselves into memory through repetition rather than novelty. By midday, lessons paused for prayer and another meal, usually lentil soup or rice. Afternoons often involved memorizations, sitting in the shade of the courtyard, murmuring lines to themselves, rocking gently as they repeated words again and again. To an outsider, it might have seemed monotonous, but for the students, this rhythm was the essence of learning, knowledge, carved into the mind through endless return. Evenings were quieter still. After the final prayer, oil lamps flickered in the chambers, their flames bending shadows across the pages of books. Some students continued reading by lamplight. Others closed their eyes and recited from memory. The madrasa was not a place of chatter or laughter. Silence itself was a discipline, guarding the mind against distraction. The role of the books were at the center of madrasa's life, yet most were not owned by students. Manuscripts were expensive, copied laboriously by hand, even after printing. Presses spread elsewhere. Many madrasas maintained small libraries, wooden cupboards, lined with volumes on theology, law, astronomy, or medicine. The act of holding a book carried weight. Students turned pages carefully, the paper thick and fibrous, the ink sometimes smudged from decades of hands. Margins often carried the notes of earlier students, a layered conversation stretching across generations. In this way, knowledge moved, not only from teacher to student, but from page to page, as each reader left behind fragments for the next. Discipline and hierarchy life in the madras was structured by rank. The madras was the center, his authority unquestioned. Senior students often acted as assistants, correcting recitations or guiding younger pupils. New students performed small tasks, fetching water, preparing ink, or keeping lamps lit. Advancement was not quick. Years might pass before a student gained recognition as a scholar in his own right. Yet ambition was patient here. To master law or theology required decades, and those who endured the slow climb often found positions as judges, imams, or teachers themselves. The madrasa was a machine of continuity, producing steady streams of trained men to fill the empire's bureaucratic and religious needs. The weight of repetition. What strikes the modern listener most is the sheer slowness of it all. Days filled with reciting the same passages, copying the same texts, repeating the same gestures. But this monotony was not a flaw. It was the very method of the madrasa. Truth. The patience required was part of the training, teaching the mind to endure repetition, to find steadiness in routine. And yet, one wonders, how did it feel to spend years within these stone walls, reciting words older than oneself, words that would outlive one's own lifetime? Did the students find comfort in the stability, or did some quietly dream of breaking away from its rhythm? The madrasa was built of stone, but its true foundation was the students. Without their steady presence, voices repeating verses, hands scratching ink across paper, the courtyard would have been silent. These students were not famous, nor did Most of their names survive in chronicles. A boy from a village in Rumelia might travel weeks to reach Istanbul. Another from Anatolia might be sent by his family, proud that he was chosen for study. Many came from modest households, their families scraping together food or coin to sustain them, hoping one day their son might serve as a judge or imam. They were often young teenagers or men in their early 20s, but study could continue for decades. The path of scholarship was long, and advancement depended as much on endurance as on brilliance. Patience was the true test. Life in small chambers. Each student lived in a small cell along the madrasa courtyard. The room was narrow, often no wider than a man's outstretched arms, with a door opening to the portico. Inside, a thin mattress, a low desk or shelf, and space for a few belongings. Light came from the open doorway by day and from a flickering oil lamp at night. In winter, the stone walls held cold, and students huddled under blankets while still reciting lessons. In summer, the air turned heavy and still, mosquitoes buzzing near the lamps. Yet these rooms were more than shelters. They were training grounds for concentration. To sit alone, repeating a single page for hours, was to practice discipline. The weight of memorization. The most demanding task was memorization. Students recited texts aloud, over and over, sometimes rocking back and forth to set the rhythm into their bodies. The courtyard often filled with a low murmur, dozens of voices chanting different lines simultaneously. A hum of words layered over the sound of water at the fountain. The process could feel endless. A single commentary on law might take months, its pages dense with arguments and citations. Grammar texts required precise recall, for a single misplaced word could alter meaning. Even mathematics, when studied, was recited line by line from older works. Knowledge was not hurried, but carved slowly into memory. Mistakes were inevitable, and correction was constant. A teacher might stop a student mid-recitation, demanding he begin again. Senior students, tasked with oversight, listened closely, pointing out errors with quiet firmness. The repetition was dull, but it was also exacting, ensuring that knowledge remained stable as it passed from one generation to the next. The small economies of study life at the madrasa was modest. Students received stipends in some institutions, but these were meager enough for bread, oil, and the occasional bit of meat. Many relied on charity. Wealthy patrons often endowed the madrasa with funds to provide daily meals, so students lined up at the kitchen for lentil stew, bread, and olives. Some earned extra coin by tutoring children in the city or copying manuscripts by hand. Their rooms might hold scraps of paper covered in ink, practice copies of texts sold cheaply to others. The work was slow and the pay was small, but it tied the student's survival directly to the written word. Friendships in silence, though the madrasa valued silence. Friendships grew quietly in its chambers. Students studied together, correcting each other's recitations or sharing small notes in the margins of books. At night, they might sit under the portico, sipping weak tea or coffee, whispering about their families or their hopes for positions after graduation. Arguments happened over borrowed books, over noise in the chambers, even over interpretations of texts, yet disputes rarely lasted. Life within the walls was too interdependent and the routine too rigid for lasting quarrels. The madrasi demanded cooperation, even if it was unspoken. Invisible labor. Much of the madrasi's daily order depended on unseen tasks. Students themselves often swept the courtyards, kept the fountain clean, and tended lamps. Senior students monitored attendance, ensuring younger pupils did not slip away during lessons. Copying texts, fetching ink, carrying water, all of these small duties sustained the institution. The medrese gave the impression of timeless scholarship, yet it was built on the mundane efforts of its students. Without their endless repetitions, their careful hands, their silent endurance, the grand continuity of Ottoman learning would have faltered. The pressure of ambition for many students. The madrasa was not only a place of study, but a ladder of ambition. To rise to the position of a mudaris or a judge meant social honor, security, and the ability to support one's family. Yet, competition was fierce. Not every student who entered the madrasa would reach such heights. Some would remain assistants. Others would leave for modest posts as scribes or village imams. Ambition, then, was tempered by patience. Each small advancement, a teacher's praise, a correct recitation, an invitation to assist in lessons was treasured, yet the years of waiting tested resolve. Some faltered, some left, while others endured, finding dignity in persistence, even if greatness never came. The question of the student's life. When one imagines the madrasa, it is easy to picture only the grandeur of learning. Yet life inside its walls was marked as much by fatigue, hunger, and monotony as by inspiration. Students carried heavy loads of memory, struggled through long winters, and lived within narrow cells. Still, through this quiet endurance, they became part of something larger, the slow chain of continuity that preserved texts, trained judges, and gave the Ottoman Empire its legal and intellectual backbone. Their lives may seem uneventful, but they were the unnoticed hands that held the empire's knowledge in place. And so, a question lingers. What did it mean to devote the best years of youth not to exploration or invention, but to steady recitation of words centuries old? Was it sacrifice, or was it a kind of preservation of self within the rhythm of tradition? Story 6. Gardens, fountains, and the silent work of Ottoman gardeners, approaching an Ottoman palace, mosque, or madrasa in the 16th or 17th century. Before reaching the doors, before even crossing the courtyards, you might first encounter a garden. These were not wild spaces, nor were they dense forests. Instead, they were carefully arranged, rows of cypress trees casting long shadows, fountains murmuring at the center, beds of tulips and roses offering muted color against the pale stone walls. The garden was both ornament and order. It displayed wealth, yes, but also reflected a worldview, one where harmony, balance, and quiet repetition mattered more than excess. For the Ottomans, a garden was never only a place to admire flowers. It was a space of ritual, a setting for reflection, and an extension of architecture into the natural world. The layout of Ottoman gardens drew from older traditions, Persian geometrical designs, Byzantine courtyards, and Islamic visions of paradise. They were often enclosed by walls, forming a protected rectangle or square. At the center, a fountain or pool rippled steadily, its sound masking the noise of the city beyond. From the fountain, stone paths stretched outward, dividing the garden into smaller beds, Each section might hold rows of tulips, carnations, or hyacinth flowers that required careful attention and seasonal replanting. Cypress trees, tall and narrow, stood like guardians along the paths. Fruit trees, such as pomegranates or apricots, provided shade and sustenance. Every element was arranged not for wildness, but for control. The orderly shaping of nature into something enduring and tranquil. The visitor entering such a garden would not be overwhelmed, but calmed. The measured spacing of trees, the steady rhythm of the fountain, the symmetry of beds all worked together to ease the mind. The gardener's routine behind this calm appearance lay hours of steady labor. Gardeners began their day early, long before visitors arrived. They swept the paths, removed fallen leaves, trimmed branches, and watered the flower beds with clay pitchers. In summer, they worked to ensure that fountains remained clean, unclogged by algae or leaves. In winter, they protected fragile plants with coverings, or carefully pruned trees to ensure spring blossoms. Unlike soldiers or scribes, gardeners rarely entered historical records. Their names are often unknown, yet their labor shaped the daily experience of courtyards, palaces, and mosques. Without them, the fountains would dry, the flowers wilt, and the quiet order dissolve into neglect. For the gardener, the work was endless repetition. Tulip bulbs had to be replanted each year. Rose bushes demanded pruning season after season. Weeds returned no matter how many times they were pulled. The reward was not dramatic transformation, but the maintenance of a gentle equilibrium. Flowers and meaning among the flowers. None became as closely tied to the Ottomans as the tulip. Imported from Central Asia, perfected in Anatolia, and eventually exported to Europe, the tulip became a symbol of refinement and order. Each varietist, striped, feathered, or plain, was carefully catalogued. Collectors competed for rare bulbs, while gardeners learned to coax them into bloom at just the right moment for festivals or palace displays. Other flowers carried meanings too. The rose evoked both beauty and devotion, often associated with the prophet in Ottoman poetry. The cypress, tall and unbending, symbolized eternity. Each plant was chosen not only for its appearance, but for its resonance within a broader cultural imagination. Gardens. As social spaces, though quiet, gardens were not empty. They hosted tea gatherings, scholarly discussions, and even political deliberations. Sultans walked slowly beneath the trees, receiving foreign envoys or conferring with advisors. Poets composed verses while seated on benches near fountains. Children played in shaded corners, yet despite these activities, the tone remained subdued. Gardens were not places of spectacle, but of measured enjoyment. They encouraged calm conversation, not loud festivity. Even gossip, when exchanged here, seemed softened by the sound of trickling water and the rustling of leaves. The philosophy of order at their heart, Ottoman gardens were an attempt to mirror paradise, a place where water flowed, trees bore fruit, and flowers bloomed in endless sequence. The geometry of paths, the symmetry of beds, and the controlled placement of fountains all expressed a belief in harmony, the alignment of human care with divine order. For the gardener, trimming a branch or sweeping a path was not merely practical but also symbolic. To maintain order in the garden was to participate in the larger order of the world. The labor may have seemed dull, pulling weeds, repairing stone borders, but within it lay a quiet philosophy that stability requires care, and that beauty is born of patience. A first glimpse picture yourself stepping through the gate of such a garden one late afternoon. The sun slants low, lighting the tops of the cypress trees. A gardener bends to sweep a path, his broom scratching softly against the stones. A fountain ripples at the center, scattering faint light across the leaves. Beyond the wall, the city buzzes with noise calls of merchants, braying of donkeys, the clash of hammers on metal butt within the enclosure. Only the sound of water and birdsong remain. It is a world of deliberate stillness, sustained by unseen hands designed to quiet the mind as much as the body. And yet, behind its calm face lies a question worth carrying forward. If so much labor was required each day to preserve such tranquility, how fragile was this harmony once those hands grew tired or were withdrawn? When you look at an Ottoman garden, the calmness of its trees and fountains might suggest permanence. The cypresses seem immovable, the roses timeless, the fountains endlessly murmuring. Yet the truth is different. Without constant labor, such order would quickly unravel. Leaves would scatter across paths, water would stagnate, weeds would push through the borders, and flowers would wither unremarked. The apparent stillness was, in fact, the product of unending movement, the hands and eyes of gardeners, adjusting, repairing, and renewing each day. The rhythm of the year, the gardener's life was not defined by weeks or months so much as by cycles of growth. Each season brought its own demands, and the garden itself dictated the pace of work. Spring meant renewal. Tulip bulbs planted in winter pushed through the soil, requiring careful tending. Fruit trees blossomed, their branches pruned to ensure healthy growth. Beds were replanted with annuals, carnations, hyacinths, and other flowers meant to bloom in sequence, one after another, so that no path or courtyard looked bare. Summer demanded vigilance. Watering was constant, especially in the heat of Anatolian and Balkan cities. Fountains themselves required scrubbing to keep them free of algae. Insects and pests were a constant battle, fought not with chemicals, but with patience, hand-picking caterpillars, encouraging birds, or using herbal remedies. Autumn was a time of harvest and preparation. Fruit was gathered: apricots, figs, pomegranates. Sand, often sent to palace kitchens or markets. Fallen leaves were swept daily, composted, or used as mulch for winter, and the soil turned in anticipation of new plantings. Winter brought silence, but not idleness. Tender plants were covered with mats or straw against the frost. Trees were pruned more aggressively, their branches stacked neatly for firewood or repairs. Snow, when it came, had to be cleared from paths, and roofs before it could weigh down the structures. Each season rolled into the next with quiet inevitability. The gardener's tasks never ended, they only changed shape. Tools of quiet precision, the gardener's tools were few but essential. A broom for sweeping paths, pruning shears for trees, a hoe for loosening soil, clay pitchers for water, and baskets for carrying cuttings or fruit. None were complex, but all required skill to use effectively. Sweeping, for instance, was not simply a matter of removing debris. The rhythm of the broom had to be steady, the strokes even, so as not to scatter dust or damage fragile borders. Pruning required judgment too much, and the tree would weaken. Too little, and the branches would crowd and reduce fruit. Watering was a matter of balance, enough to nourish, but not so much as to drown roots or encourage rot. Through these simple tools, gardeners shaped the daily life of palaces and mosques more quietly than any official decree. Tulip mania and the gardener's burden in the early 18th century. During what historians call the tulip era, the pressure on gardeners increased. The tulip had become a craze among elites, its varieties cultivated, named, and displayed with pride. Wealthy patrons competed for rare bulbs, and festivals celebrated their brief but brilliant bloom. For the gardener, this meant precision. Tulips had to emerge at exactly the right moment. Too early, and their beauty would fade before the festival. Beds were arranged so that blooms appeared in sequence, maintaining color throughout. Spring. Gardeners marked bulbs, rotated soil, and tracked weather patterns. But behind the orderly rows was calculation, worry, and countless small adjustments. The gardener's role was not only labor, but quiet performance. For visitors, for the gardeners, it was first and foremost a workplace. They moved, constantly hauling water, trimming hedges, sweeping leaves, their bodies bent with repetition, their hands calloused by tools. Pay was modest, their names unrecorded, but their work visible in every neat path and every blossom that opened on time. They worked in pairs or small teams, dividing tasks. One might sweep paths while another pruned branches. Younger apprentices often handled the heavier labor, carrying water, hauling soil, digging trenches. Older gardeners oversaw timing and balance, instructing when to plant or cut. In this way, knowledge passed not through books, but through demonstration, gesture, and long repetition. A social role in quiet though humble. Gardeners were not invisible. Their work brought them close to powerful figures. They overheard conversations as they trimmed branches near palace courtyards. They provided fruit and flowers for officials. They were noticed when work faltered, praised when gardens flourished. Their presence shaped the mood of spaces where sultans strolled, scholars debated, or families gathered for rest. The gardener's influence was subtle but constant. The cleanliness of a courtyard, the fragrance of a rosebed. Gardeners knew that order was always temporary. A sudden frost could ruin a season's work. A storm could break branches carefully pruned for years. The garden required endless recovery, endless repair. In this way, the gardener's life was a lesson in impermanence. Beauty was always fleeting, stability always provisional, season after season, knowing that nothing could be fully secured. A cycle without end if you were to walk through an Ottoman garden across a single year, you would see this cycle play out in spring. Gardeners crouched low, clearing beds and planting bulbs. In summer, they moved with pitchers, bent against the heat, their shadows long in the afternoon light. In autumn, they carried baskets of fruit, sweeping paths each evening as leaves fell endlessly. In winter, they tended to silence, wrapping trunks, sharpening tools, and waiting for thaw. Each act was small, almost forgettable. The gardener's world was one of patience, where the reward was not dramatic change, but the subtle continuation of order. Reflection. When you imagine the Ottoman garden as it appeared in its prime fountains, steady paths clear, flowers blooming, it is easy to overlook the hands that made it so. The gardeners were rarely seen, their work almost invisible, and yet Without them, the harmony of these courtyards would collapse in a single season. It raises an unsettled question. If the beauty of a garden rests on labor that is never finished, is the garden itself permanent or only a fragile illusion, renewed each day by those who quietly cared for it? You've been listening to Boring Pastimes. The Ottoman Empire has faded, yet its coffeehouses, hammams, caravanserais, kitchens, madrasis, and gardens still whisper across stone and memory. Their details are quiet, their rhythms slow, their beauty fragile. As you rest, let the patience of their routines remind you that much of history is not loud or sudden, but steady, enduring, and small. May your night be as calm as a fountain in a forgotten courtyard.